Hello and welcome to the Airline Business Podcast, discussing key news and trends in the global airline sector. This time, the rain in Spain is mostly IAGs, as it makes a surprise move for Air Europa, while carriers in Europe, and much of the rest of the world come to that, dig in as the climate turns colder. Emirates finally pins down its long-haul fleet plans during the Dubai Air Show, and can Brazil's aviation sector finally fulfil its potential? My name's Graham Dunn, and I'm joined by my airline business colleague, Lewis Harper.
Hi, Graham.
And Lewis, it's been a busy and hectic few weeks, not just for ourselves, we've both been on the road travelling, but also for the sector as a whole. It's a strong month of news.
It has been, yeah. It hasn't been difficult to fill the kind of last print issue of the year, certainly for airline business. I mean, as you mentioned, I was in Brasilia for the Outer Airline Leaders Forum. Of course, you were in Kuwait City, weren't you?
For the Arab Air Carriers Organisation Conference. And obviously, a couple of weeks later, we had the Dubai Air Show, and Max Kingsley-Jones will be joining us later, was part of our team at that show as well. And obviously, Emirates was dominating the horizon there. But I think across all the events we've been to and the commentary that's come out, especially around, it's obviously been the third quarter reporting season for a lot of airlines in Europe and the US and so forth. You know, there's this general backdrop of a slightly more challenging environment. Now that seems to come, you know, I think I usually run airlines approach their winter of discontent, bleak winter, a series of failed puns, pretty much every winter, especially for the last 2 or 3 years, it's felt like the market could fall down at any point, and you know, a number of those pressures, whether that be, you know, what's going to happen with Brexit or the uncertainty of trade wars and the US and China, these things have been there, and I'm not sure we're much clearer now of any of those.
No, I think the few things are for sure. Obviously, the cargo market, obviously less important for some carriers than others, but is pretty challenging at the moment. We're still seeing every month, year on year, kind of demand is down. But as you say, it's a curious picture because we're always talking from the context of the kind of 2017 levels of profitability, which were kind of as high as they've ever been. So, but undoubtedly, they're heading in the kind of the wrong direction profits for a lot of carriers. Not to say that they're still not making a lot of money in a lot of cases, but as we talked about before, you look at the US market where obviously there's been a lot of consolidation that's happened there. You're getting the three majors. Their results are very strong. They're seeing profits rise year on year, despite some obvious challenges around the MAX, etc. But then we look to Europe, and there's a slightly different picture. Profits haven't kind of been so strong year on year, and also, as we talk about a lot, there are carriers on the fringes that are really struggling.
It's a paradoxical market. I think the European airline market, because you have both historically. They're making as much money as they've ever made as a sector as a whole. Equally, we're seeing quite a number of casualties. Obviously, Thomas Cook was the big news a month or so ago, but you're seeing airline failures, and you're seeing carriers like Alitalia, which remains in limbo. We've been looking at the results of the big three, the major three carrier groups, and IAG, British Airways and Iberia's parent, Lufthansa Group and Air France KLM, they still all reported, historically very strong profits in that third quarter, but they're all a little bit down. And I think what's interesting is they're taking a very cautious approach around capacity, around outlook for the time ahead.
That's correct. So a lot of the commentary, as you say, the profits, on face value were relatively strong. But as you say, looking ahead particularly to next year, there's a lot of talk of capacity increases not being as strong as expected. You look at Lufthansa, and they're talking about kind of consolidating operations around Austrian, Brussels Airlines. They're certainly not as bullish as they have been in kind of 2 or 3 years ago in their outlook. And I think a lot of the analyst comment I've seen around this is sensible. It's We're seeing obviously a big theme in Europe as well has been fares being rock bottom. Airlines struggling with the capacity they have to make that gets any momentum on fares in the right direction for them. So there is, I think, certainly a theme there. In some cases like Norwegian, that's quite extreme. You look at their year-on-year capacity figures, and they're kind of 20-30% down. So there's a lot happening, and the MAX situation as well. While it's a lot of airlines talk about the financial impact of it in terms of the overall kind of sectors in each region, I think it hasn't necessarily been necessarily a bad thing having that capacity out of the market. I think in an environment where you look at Ryanair, for example, again, they're highly profitable, but the pressure on fares is kind of seems to be a constant at the moment.
It's interesting that you're seeing it the carrier groups, but it is true of the low cost carriers groups as well. EasyJet, they're looking at capacity growth over the coming year at the low end of their traditionally grow somewhere between 3 and 8% a year, and that's going to be at the low end of it. Ryanair continuing to talk about that more restrained capacity view, and then Norwegian, who you mentioned again, really interesting airline. They actually, their third quarter was a record for them. But you would kind of expect progress in that. So they've gone through a major optimization, cost cutting efforts that trim the network. They've been obviously through this massive expansion and been urgently searching for those profits. So they're reporting some progress in that third quarter. I suppose the question for them is making that sustainable.
Yeah, just on that as well. There's interesting, obviously. Norwegian and JetBlue have been talking about possibly having a closer relationship in the future. And obviously with JetBlue's plans to start transatlantic flying in 2021, there's something interesting there. Obviously, a lot of people, Michael O'Leary will constantly tell you that Norwegian won't exist in 2 weeks' time. But if at the moment they've just appointed a new CEO, Norwegian, obviously Jacob Schramm, I presume is how you pronounce his name.
That sounds quite convincing. I like that.
Again, interesting, he comes from a retail background, so he was at Circle K, I think, the convenience store group. He was their European head. So, and just an aside, Air New Zealand appointed someone from a retail background in Greg Foran, who was from Walmart, I think, in the US. He's a New Zealand native, but he was in the US. So an indication there, when we talk about growth for airlines as well, they may be looking more towards those kind of ancillary kind of areas for growth, which may be reflected in who they're choosing as CEOs. But just an aside,
and Norwegian actually is, as another aside to your aside, I'll trump your aside. It is interesting that Norwegian, who've gone through this leadership change, Norwegian have done extraordinary things to have grown out of this tiny, small regional carrier and have genuinely changed the competitive dynamic on the transatlantic force. A lot of activity from their competitors, but it's been difficult for them to find profits. That has really, Bjorn Kjos was the driver of that, and you had his colleague Bjorn Kies, I think it is.
Yeah,
I think it's really testing my Norwegian pronunciations, and they sort of led that for quite a long time. And real aviation specialists have grown that knowledge, and you have a Norwegian now, a leadership team which has kind of come from a more business perspective, I guess, which I think just reflects where Norwegian is putting its focus and emphasis at the moment.
And then back to the kind of the big network carriers in Europe, we've got Air France, KLM. They had a big investor day actually just before I think their results came out around the same time. I don't think we've had anything massively new from them. I think the theme we're very much getting, and we've written again. We talk about stories we've written several times. I think the Ben Smith kind of simplification of their
it is a word that
structures.
keeps. If you search FlightGlobal.com for Air France and simplification, you'll find an alarming number of stories with similar headlines. But that is, that's their sort of the message they're trying to do, and as a business, that was quite a complex, complex fleets, complex array of brands. That's clearly what they're trying to do, but there's a lot of work there.
Yeah, and I think they're very keen to talk about what they're going to do because they don't want any nasty surprises. We all know that, as anyone leading Air France, KLM has. May have had good ideas in the past, but the problem hasn't been the ideas as much as the ability to implement them. So, at the moment, as far as you can have at Air France-KLM. The unions are kind of as on board as they've ever been, I guess. And then, of course, earlier in the year we had the issue with ownership of Air France-KLM, with the Dutch government upping its stake to match that of the French government. So, they're talking a good game, and it seems logical what they're talking about in terms of consolidating the brands and as we again simplifying the fleet structure and that kind of thing. But as ever with Air France-KLM, you really want to see where they are in 2 or 3 years' time, whether we're still writing that piece saying that they're planning to simplify things, or whether it's actually happening, and that's the big question.
And both Air France-KLM and more Lufthansa continue to be linked with Alitalia in some way, but that Alitalia attempts that is proving a struggle now, getting on board some of those Italian investors. So that story continues to rumble in the background. The Italian market, always an extremely attractive and appealing one, in which the low-cost carriers have made huge grounds, but the network carriers continue to look at. The other carrier that probably, which made, again, quite big, had its capital markets day in November, IAG. And in that, we had Willie Walsh talking about, showing a glimpse into the future, saying that he would probably step down in a couple of years' time. And again, there's how you fill that role and getting IAG into its future shape and the various bits and pieces. And
and just on that as well, he talks a bit about branding, and I think that links obviously to particularly in the Spanish market, there's an acquisition in the works, I think, which, as you mentioned in the introduction, is a bit of a surprise for us.
Air Europa, and one of our colleagues here said nobody had a headline, I think, which was nobody expected the Spanish acquisition. Dominic Perry, I'll give a shout out for that. I thought it was very good, but nobody did. It was the move for Air Europa, a Spanish airline, was a real surprise, and we'll talk a bit more about that in part 2.
Europe's aviation industry is facing many challenges, from socio-economic to regulatory and environmental. The sector continues to adapt and evolve to overcome them, striving for a safer, more sustainable and more integrated Europe. The A4E Aviation Summit, in association with FlightGlobal, provides the perfect opportunity to take part in the discussion. For more information, go to a4eaviationsummit.eu, and the event takes place on the 3rd of March 2020 in Brussels.
So yes, it was a big surprise when, it shouldn't be a surprise to us, we were meant to be following this, but it was a surprise to us. I think it's a surprise to a lot of people when IAG announced it was acquiring Air Europa, the Spanish airline. Again, one of the reasons I guess that was a bit of a surprise was Air Europa, they're a member of Sky Team, they had been looking at possible people to acquire, but Air France-KLM had always been seen as most likely. But of course that whole sector has changed a little bit because of the Delta acquisition of LATAM.
It's a very fascinating development. There are all sorts of things going on that alliances alone. So the knock-on effect of as you mentioned, the Delta investment in LATAM is LATAM's leaving one world, and then you can't help but think as much as IAG talk about the Air Europa proposed acquisition being about building Madrid as a hub, which makes sense, but you can't help but see it in the context of the fact that they're losing LATAM Airlines as a one world partner, and obviously that's a huge market to be looking into, particularly Brazil, as we'll talk about in a moment. So there are all sorts of considerations. The other really interesting one is just how big IAG's presence would then become in the Spanish market. I mean, there's obviously the question whether regulators are going to allow it to happen. You would presume there'll be some mandated kind of changes to their network as a result of it. But yeah, it
feels as though they obviously feel the competitive side of it becomes more manageable, almost certainly because of the ending of the relationship with LATAM, so that you have a different competitor on that route. I mean, it is really interesting IAG's presence in Spain. So obviously Iberia found a carrier in Spain's biggest operator, and then they developed their Iberia Express operation, which was short haul from Madrid, I think that's right. Then IAG acquired Vueling, which is kind of had a half investment in short haul. Largely, Barcelona's its biggest base. Obviously, it has bases use that across parts of Europe. Level, which is its long-haul low-cost brand, which it has used on long-haul flights from Barcelona, and now Air Europa.
Yeah, so the attraction, I think, with Air Europa, as we're just touching on, is it is a huge, has huge connectivity with South America, and I think, as we're saying, having lost that, well, in the process of losing that LATAM relationship, there's an obvious advantage to it there. Obviously, this is Southern Europe, so it's not necessarily LATAM would obviously be a big player, relatively big player into Spain in terms of overseas carriers. But Willie Walsh talking about that mix of brands. I think he said in the Investor Day that that probably isn't sustainable. So we may be looking at them consolidating some of those Spanish brands, particularly if Air Europa deal goes through. I mean, they've said for now they'll keep the Air Europa name, but yeah. So it just gives them, I guess, that kind of Latin American connectivity they may be losing with LATAM. Air Europa's Max customer has got Max aircraft on order, so there's a bit of synergy with the fleet there. It's a leisure focused carrier. Obviously, it has short haul routes as well. I don't know if they'll be as interesting, but obviously they're I think percentage wise looking at in Madrid moving from around IAG carriers around just below 50% to up into the 60s in terms of the seats that IAG would be accounting for in Madrid. So it's a relatively big move in that regard as well. So certainly as you say, maybe we should have seen this coming, but there is a logic to it. Air Europa's always, I'll be honest, a bit of a mystery for us as journalists. We've tried in vain a lot of time to get to talk to them, and I guess
the closest I ever came, I once did a press trip which involved a connecting flight in Barcelona, and we were going to meet in Mallorca, I think, the man himself. The connecting flight failed, and so we did a conference call with Mr. Hidalgo from a room in Barcelona Airport. My poor language skills, because I didn't speak any Spanish.
Right.
I didn't speak English, so questions were asked via a UK journalist who had some sort of broken Spanish, some very elaborate pronunciations. But so the quote had, various. You read back the quotes, and they'd be, we're very interested in taking 10 more British Aerospace. Something about this, and then 5 of Embraers, and you go, well, I can't run that. So anyway, that was the most. As you say, you should really know more on that region, having been out in Latin America recently yourself.
Yeah, and experiencing some of those language challenges actually, because obviously we're there. We produce our dailies there. We did 3 issues of Airline Business Daily there, which went really well. And because of so much going on in that region at the moment, it was a great time to be out there, really. But yeah, the location was Brasilia, so the capital of Brazil, not a place that obviously has the high profile in terms of a destination for business or tourism, really, that say Sao Paulo or Rio would. But it's where the government's based. It's a fascinating city in the sense it was built. There was nothing there. I think it was built in the 50s, 60s, and now obviously the whole government apparatus is there, and that was the reason Alta chose it, because the Brazilian market. It's always been a bit of an enigma. I mean, it's that I think I've written the comment for the new issue of AB and kind of said, if you can think of any issue that's affecting a market in the world, the chances are the Brazilian market probably has some version of it. And in the same way, if you look at any opportunity that is in many markets in the world, the chances are you'd see it in Brazil. So it's an interesting one. I think that the sense I got was that Alta wanted it there because whatever you think about the current administration, Bolsonaro, the president, they have, and there are areas where maybe I might disagree with some of their outlook on the world, but certainly from a business perspective, they're showing themselves to be more business friendly. And one of the biggest problems in Brazil is it's an expensive place to run an airline. So particularly a low cost carrier, for example, fuel costs are a few percentage points higher than the global average. It's quite heavy on regulation of airlines. So we saw earlier this year that the Brazilian Congress tried to reintroduce a requirement that all airlines give every passenger 23 kilograms of free luggage, for example. So you can imagine if you're running or thinking of starting up a low-cost carrier or or an ultra low cost carrier in that market, you're hearing that, you're going to be concerned. So it's a market where there's massive potential, but where to start? I mean, it's Brazil's had a lot of economic problems in recent years. It's seen talking about touching things we see elsewhere. It's seen obviously LATAM, LAN and TAM merge into a big carrier there. We've had Avianca Brazil fall over this year, and another aspect of Brazil, something that makes it fascinating, is the majority of the Amazon rainforest is there. And when you talk about environmental issues and things that really capture the imagination in terms of the human being's impact on the environment, we've got probably one of the most talked about places for that. I've probably missed stuff because there's so much going on there, but it does seem there is an effort by the government to encourage more commercial aviation. So we've seen them loosen the foreign ownership rules, for example. So now unusually in the global market now, an airline could be 100% owned by a foreign business. That hasn't been properly tested yet, and intriguingly, Air Europa was one of the first carriers that is potentially going to try and take advantage of that. So they have applied, I think, to operate domestic services in Brazil. So again, I'm not sure on the progress on that, and I think until that an airline with a foreign owner is actually operating in the country, I think it's difficult to judge whether that is going to be truly successful. But so the government talks a good game. It's the last round of airport concessions were quite well received. So there's private investment going into the industry. So, but a lot of unanswered questions still.
It is, and I think it's interesting, and it's the point that you'd made about, I suppose, and we've seen this quite a lot in Latin America, where policies have shifted at a government level quite dramatically. You've seen that in Mexico around the building of the airport and then the closing, the total change of about turn on the airport there. And there was another reminder of that in Argentina, I guess.
Yeah, the Macri administration, obviously, Macri lost the presidential election. He was seen as someone who had finally allowed an industry to go up that wasn't massively favouring Aerolíneas, obviously the local state-owned carrier there. So we're actually seeing real, genuine progress in the industry. Norwegian, we were talking about earlier, obviously have Norwegian Air Argentina operating there. We're seeing Fly Bondi and others. And others actually building up. We're starting to build a low-cost kind of market there because of those policies. But of course, overnight you go from that to reverting back to a government that kind of, for all intents and purposes, seems to have an agenda similar to the older administrations, which are less business-friendly and more about protecting the local assets. Hearing the CEO panel at ALTA, it was. People were Enrique Cueto, the LATAM CEO, and Pedro Harbour, the Copa CEO, both suggesting they didn't think there would be massive change. It may be that the government might continue those kind of policies, but I think the frustration you really feel in that market is, like you were saying, if you want to do something, you're constantly, I guess, looking over your shoulder, thinking, is something going to happen that fundamentally changes my operating environment. You compare it to Europe, for example. Of course, aside from Brexit, which we won't go into, you do have a relatively well functioning kind of Europe-wide aviation market, for example. That I guess that a lot of the Latin carriers would be relatively envious of, because we're just talking about Brazil, but like you hinted at, these issues exist, and obviously just flying between two countries in that region raises a lot of challenges, because they will have quite different regulations and the Brazilian carriers like GOL will talk about their pilots working time directives, for example, will be affected flying intra-region versus flying within Brazil, and there's all sorts of considerations that still make it challenging, but there's certainly an effort to do something about it in Brazil, and they have massive plans. I mean, it's one of the biggest economies in the world, and if someone can make it work, then great. But that's I think people need a lot of convincing that it's truly a place where you can put your money and be sure that the rules of the game aren't going to change the next time there's an election or
So you can read much more from our coverage from the ALTA event and on all things Latin America at flightglobal.com/ALTA, as ALTA,
Yep,
I think.
that's right.
In part 3, we'll be looking at another market which has been making a lot of news, the Middle East.
The A4E Aviation Summit 2020, which happens in association with FlightGlobal, includes speakers such as Ben Smith, the Air France KLM CEO, EasyJet Chief Lohan Lundgren, Willie Walsh of IAG, Carsten Spohr of Lufthansa, and Ryanair Group CEO Michael O'Leary. For more information, go to a4eaviationsummit.eu. Welcome back. I'm joined by Max Kingsley-Jones, the Executive Director of Content at FlightGlobal. And Max, you're just back from the Dubai Air Show, aren't you?
Yeah, it was an interesting show as usual. A few camels on the way in every day, which is always makes you feel like you're in the right part of the world, in the desert.
Yeah.
And quite an exciting show, actually, a lot going on.
Yeah, so we know that Dubai can be a mixed one, kind of, because some years there's been some absolutely huge years with huge orders, then a bit quieter. How did this one play out kind of overall?
Yeah, so there's a bit of a steady tick over, really, during the show. We had the show topped and tailed with Emirates announcements, which we were sort of expecting, although there was a few twists in the tail. And we also saw some MAX orders, and we saw an appearance of Etihad as well. So quite an interesting show. And there was also the usual quite exciting static part with some big airliners. We had, I think, 3 787s in the static and an A380 amongst other things, as well as a variety of other smaller aircraft.
Okay, and it's very much Emirates, wasn't it? That's the interesting one. You've tried to make sense of Emirates orders in a great piece you can read on flightglobal.com. But just run us through. So and obviously you had the advantage as well. We did an airline business cover interview with Tim Clark not long before the event. So you've got a real insight into their thinking and their orders, and you've tried to make sense, haven't you, of the numbers? Because at face value they ordered a lot of aircraft, but when you actually look below the surface, the numbers stack up in a slightly different way, don't they?
Yeah, well, just during the show, from the Tuesday, I think it was, we had, the Monday actually, we had 50 A350s ordered. We were expecting an order for 40 A330s and 30 A350s. So overall, the number of aircraft ordered from Airbus was lower in terms of units. And then we had 30 787s ordered on Wednesday of the show, towards the end of the show. But of course, that was an order that's been really sat in limbo for 2 years, because they actually announced an order or a commitment for 40 787s 2 years ago at the Dubai show in 2017. So that was effectively the consummating of a 2-year deal and 10 units less. But if you dig deeper, what they actually did was cancelled 30, or substituted, which is probably the politically correct term to describe what they did, 30 777 orders, so mainly 777Xs, but some 777-300ERs. And then on the Airbus side, they cancelled 39 A380s, basically the last 39 A380s
Right.
they've got on order. So they've only got about 10 left to come now, and that programme then ends. So overall, I think they only moved the dial about 30 aircraft actually over the last 2 years, which is kind of reflects where they're at, because things have moved on for the Gulf carriers over the last couple of years. The world economy's impacted their expansion plans. There's been a political unrest in the region as well. So no surprise that the fleet growth is slowing. A lot of those aircraft also are replacements. So overall, what we're seeing is a good consolidation by Emirates with new equipment rather than massive expansion, which the headline numbers might indicate.
And on the 330neo, am I right that Clark still hinted there may still be orders for them in the future, or is that
Yes, he
completely
hinted that in the middle of the week, and then subsequently ordered Boeing 787. So, and we haven't had a chance to speak to Tim since that. But the vibe I'm getting speaking to the Emirates people I know is that the A330, the door to the A330neo order may still be open at some point. But Tim's been very vocal, as we've talked about on the podcast in the past, and we talked about in the article in Airline Business and online, about the poor performance of the engine makers, particularly Rolls-Royce. And I think he has concerns about the maturity of the engine on the A330neo, and so I think he wants to see how that plays out over the next year or two. He doesn't want to be the canary in the coal mine, as it were. With that, he wants someone else to find out whether that engine's going to really work as well. The question marks really are because that engine on the 330neo is a derivative of the engine that powers the 787, the Trent 1000 that powers the 787, and so there's potential future unrest, if you like, in the reliability. And so I think he just wants to see how that plays out. So we'll see there. But certainly on the... it's nice to see the Boeing side of things finally sorted out after rumours and speculation and indications by Emirates. So that's moved on, and we've kind of got a solid picture now what's going on with Boeing.
And how much is this? So we're looking at kind of the mid-size kind of wide bodies. How much is still to play out on the larger wide bodies? So is there still more to come for them in the near future in terms of orders? Or
I think they're pretty much full now. They've got about 126, I think, 777X is coming.
Right.
The question that we haven't got the answer to, nor has Emirates, is when they will be starting to come, because the aircraft should have been in flight test. It isn't. It may enter flight test in the next few weeks or months. That's Boeing's ambition. And then it may be delivered about a year and a half later. So we're looking at mid-2021. So I think, again, until that programme is revived and starts to move in the direction of entry into service, we won't get any more clarity really around what Emirates' plans are for that.
Okay. And moving across to look at there, of course, the big rival Boeing in a very, goes without saying, a very challenging year. What sense did you get overall of Boeing's mood going into the show?
Well, obviously the MAX is the big story. There was no MAX aircraft, no 737 MAX on the stand that I saw anyway. The 737 was represented on the Boeing stand by a model of the Boeing converted freighter edition of the current 737, the next generation 737. So that wasn't there. Obviously there's no 737 MAX on display because the aircraft's grounded. But they did announce some orders for the aircraft. There was not the big IAG type order. We thought there might be something from one of the big players, a nice big statement by Boeing. That didn't happen. But it was important that they didn't get completely blown away by Airbus on this one. So they had Air Astana, which is a new customer for the MAX, ordering 30. And they also had Sun Express, which is an existing MAX customer, topping up its order by converting some options, 10. And there was also an undisclosed customer ordering 20 plus 10. So the MAX was being talked about. I think perhaps there's some sporty deals on offer at the moment because Boeing has the advantage of sort of earlier delivery slots than Airbus. Airbus can't actually respond to any demand really at the moment for MAX customers because it's sewn up A320neo deliveries until 2024, 2025. So there's no real early slots there. So it's kind of got its hands tied behind its back on that one. So it's important that the 737 was being sold at the show, and it wasn't a complete flatline by any means.
Yeah, and in terms of did they give any indication? I know they were talking about by the end of the year it would fly again. Is there any more indication on that?
Yeah, I mean they caveat everything they say with obviously it's up to the regulator, but their aspiration or ambition now is to have the aeroplane ready to go back into service in January. Or the January time frame, I think is the word they use, which I presume means quarter 1, but subject to approval from the US Federal Aviation Administration. So that's where they're at with that. And they are very keen to remind people that the aeroplane has a great value proposition. It was selling well before the accident. They're confident that once the aircraft is proved to be safe and back in service, that they'll be able to continue where they were before, and you know the aircraft will be selling in the numbers they expect it to and come back at Airbus strongly. From
a consumer point of view as well, we hear there's that concern, isn't there? Are people going to want to fly on a MAX aircraft? I mean, we've heard United talk about the fact they will make it very clear if you're booking onto a MAX flight, and they'll let you rebook onto a non-MAX flight if you're unhappy about that. Do you get any sense from these airlines ordering whether they're worried about that, or is that just something they think will pass?
We've talked about this actually to a few airlines. We had the Airlines 2050 conference in October in London, and we talked to TUI about the branding, and they haven't decided yet what they're going to do. Tim Clark, who doesn't have Maxes in his fleet, but he does have them via Fly Dubai, he feels strongly about the fact that the name has to change. We're already seeing some airlines doing that. But what we did get at the show was the sense that these airlines that were ordering the aircraft, you'd expect them to say this, of course, very confident that the aircraft will be returned to service soon and will be returned to service with a full safety approval, and there won't be any question marks over it. But I think it's really important that these airlines are not seen to be trying to cover up the fact that the aircraft is a MAX, because I think that would be a very dangerous public relations strategy to go on, I think, and to try and disguise it to the consumers will probably be more damaging than just being open about it.
Yeah, and obviously the MAX is something we've hear about every day. To moving from that to an airline and a CEO, of course, we don't hear from that often. So we've got Tony Douglas, near neighbours to Emirates and Etihad. We all know they've had a lot of financial trouble, and Tony Douglas has been there a couple of years now, I think, to try and turn it around. And he was at the event. Did he have much to say about how things are going at Etihad?
Yeah, it was great to see Tony Douglas turn up at the show. Obviously, the Dubai Air Show represents the whole of the UAE, and Abu Dhabi is the capital of the UAE, so it's important that Etihad's there. They had their Manchester City aeroplane in the static park, and Tony Douglas turned up to unveil an initiative which we'll be seeing in Europe fairly soon, which is a 787 being delivered in a special colour scheme called the Green Liner. He insisted that this wasn't a box ticking exercise for the environment, and we have to believe him on that, although there wasn't too much detail about what this Green Liner initiative had, other than the fact it was a nice new paint scheme on an aircraft being delivered from Boeing. But they are going to roll out some things around this as the aircraft is enters into service in January. I think it's on the Brussels route from Abu Dhabi. But obviously, journalists like to, when they don't get much chance to see the CEO of Etihad these days. Unlike his predecessor James Hogan, who was very visible. Anyone who was covering Etihad in the old days used to find that they could get whatever they wanted in terms of access to James Hogan. Tony Douglas is the other extreme, but he's obviously been busy transforming the airline back into a revamped, revised business that's going to deliver to its shareholder. So he was asked about the way that the transformation program's going, and he was very honest, actually. He said it's a long journey and they are ahead of where they hope to be, but they still have a long way to go to return to we assume to return to profitability, which is obviously their ambition and target.
But nothing too much on their fleet at the event. They're kind of, I know they've had some cancellations recently. That's kind of quiet on that front, I guess.
The only thing really he said about fleet was, if you did the maths, you could work out they're going to consolidate around about 100 aircraft, because they've got about just over 30 from memory 787s at the moment, and they said that the 787 will eventually reach 51 aircraft, and it will be about 50% of their fleet. And the fleet at the moment is just over 100 aircraft, so that sounds like as the 787 fleet grows, they'll be returning or retiring older aircraft, and so the fleet's going to consolidate around 100 units, which is obviously quite small compared with the airline's Gulf carrier neighbours, Emirates and Qatar Airways, which are twice that and some.
Yeah, and one interesting development around Etihad is the potential JV with Air Arabia. Is that right?
Yeah, well, they're working on a low-cost airline partnership, but that's all we know at the moment. They're not saying any more. I think there's going to be more details come out in the new year, so we're waiting to hear more about that.
Okay, that's great. Thanks for your time, Max, and you can read all of our coverage from Dubai at flightglobal.com/Dubai. Don't forget that in mid-December there's a special digital-only issue of Airline Business sponsored by CFM International. For more information, go to flightglobal.com/airline business.
So that's all for this time. You can find links to the stories we've referenced, including Max's analysis of Emirates' ever-changing fleet plans, in the podcast notes. And if you've enjoyed this podcast, please leave a review. And don't forget to subscribe to the podcast. We'll be back again in December. In the meantime, you can stay up to date on breaking airline news stories at flightglobal.com. See you next time.